After attacks in France and Austria, the United Kingdom raised its terror threat alert to highly likely. So what are we looking at here? The prospect of more random acts of violence or an overreaction by authorities? This is Roundtable. And a warm welcome from me, David Foster. In Britain, it's been reported that there's a perfect storm brewing. COVID restrictions bringing protests and possible Brexit disorder, leaving security forces stretched and possibly vulnerable. The UK recently raised the country's terror threat level from substantial to severe, meaning a terrorist attack is highly likely, according to the government. The change follows the shooting in the Austrian capital, Vienna, in which 4 people died, and the attacks in France that killed 3 people in Nice and the teacher Samuel Paty in Paris last month. The French President Emmanuel Macron hosted the Austrian leader Sebastian Kurz for talks this week and held a video summit with other EU leaders to discuss the fight against terrorism. The EU's counter-terrorism chief said earlier this year, "The fact that the number of attacks has declined in the EU does not mean that the threat has disappeared." This week marks 5 years since one of Europe's worst attacks in recent times, the coordinated shootings and suicide bombings in Paris that targeted bars, restaurants, a stadium and the Bataclan Theatre, leaving 130 people dead and hundreds injured. The concern now is of an increase in attacks. So how should Europe face any new threats? Well, we can welcome to this round table out of Florence in Italy, Richard McNeil, Wilson counter-extremism researcher at the Robert Schuman Centre. We go to Birmingham in the UK and welcome once again Lewis Herrington, author of Understanding Martyrdom, Terrorism in Europe. And then to Nottingham, and there is Rizwaan Sabir, assistant lecturer in counter-terrorism and counterinsurgency at Liverpool John Moores University. Riz and the others, thanks for coming back because you've all been on Roundtable before. But Riz, let me ask you this first of all. In fact, this is for all of you. We're never told the reasons why a terror threat level has been raised, the specific reasons. But from what you understand, are we in more danger now than we were, say, 3 months ago in the UK and Europe?
Well, this is the interesting thing, I think, about this latest elevation of the threat level is that the Home Secretary Priti Patel's statements that have been put out into the public domain don't indicate any actionable intelligence that seem to suggest a higher threat of actual armed violence or terrorism happening on the streets of the UK. But instead, what the official government line seems to be indicating is that the threat level has been elevated based on the occurrence of violent attacks in France and in Austria. And this is purely a responsive and defensive mechanism that has been that has led to the elevation of the threat level in the UK. And this is what I find to be most interesting, is because generally intelligence seems to indicate that an attack is going to happen, and that's why the threat is elevated. But here we're operating on the premise that an attack has happened elsewhere, but we're going to take actions that elevate the threat level based not on evidence or intelligence, but rather the fear that something may happen.
Okay, well let's ask Lewis this one, because I think in your book you put out the theory that these things do happen in clusters, that one will encourage another, etc., etc. Is that what you think may happen here?
This kind of the situation right now is tremendous isolation. When we look at the people in the weeks leading up to the attacks, and I've looked at 80 men for the last 20 years, their whole life story. These are individuals who struggle with narcissistic personality disorder. They are looking for the prestige that goes with carrying out this attack. So what happens is when one puts their hand up and says, right, I'm going to go, it encourages others. It says, right, now I can get some legitimacy. Now I can act. I can be seen to be doing the same as everybody else. So that kind of rally around the flag gets things going. And especially because people are isolated now as well. You know, these are specific individuals who act under specific conditions at specific times. So I predicted it straight after the first one. I said there'll be at least 3 more attacks, and there was
so
3
it's
more
not
attacks.
as if there is
straight
some major intelligence network behind setting up these attacks. These are people who have personality disorders and decide to carry them out. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying if you look at when I took all 80 individuals and I said, right, let's see what do we know about these 80 people. Not opinions, not a head full of, you know, opinions or expert opinions. What do we know about these 80 men? And if you look at them specifically, only 3 things stand out across everything. Forget poverty, forget education, forget all of that stuff. 3 variables. 1, history of substance abuse. 2, trouble in personal relationships. 3, previously unobservant before they turned to extremism. And you put all that stuff together and you see that actually these individuals, you know, they turn to extremism as a way of sorting out their lives. They spend a couple of years involved in what we call the extremist fellowship. Within a couple of years, they start to experience guilt, shame, and remorse because they've got cognitive dissonance between this new identity and this old identity. And when they reach the jumping off point, when they reach the point where they say, actually, I don't want to go back to active addiction. I can't commit suicide. I can't go back to active addiction. I've been listening to the guys on the internet. The solution, the rational choice, martyrdom is a rational choice for men who are struggling with guilt, shame, and remorse.
So
it didn't.
Can I put this thought to Richard then, if I may? The anniversary of Bataclan, that seemed, on the basis of what Lewis has just described, to be more centralized, more command controlled than the individuals with personality disorders that he has described, other than the fact that both can be deadly. Which is the bigger danger to society?
I mean, if we look at the direction at which these sort of violent attacks are heading, we see this sort of fragmentation of networks. We see it being very much focused on individuals carrying out these acts in a very kind of dispersed way, taking a lot of inspiration from Islamic State, for instance, but not really having any verifiable links to organizations and to networks. And I think we ought to be careful about assuming that the threat is increasing, especially as we seem to be having this fragmentation and this individualization of attacks. But I think also we need to be careful. I mean, Priti Patel, I think one of the most important statements that she's made about this is to say that the British public should be in no doubt that we, the British government, will take the strongest possible action to protect our national security. And I think the key words in that statement are the British public. A lot of these responses, in terms of putting in responses after an attack, are not about creating some kind of effective response to terrorism, but is about demonstrating as a political mechanism that the government can be strong on terrorism and on the threat of terrorism. So I think a lot of this this discussion.
So you're saying it's a fig leaf? It's just a pretend response, just designed to make it look as though the government is in control, when perhaps it isn't?
I maybe wouldn't be so strong, but I would say certainly that a lot of this is political theatre. Terrorism and responses to violent extremism are political issues. They're not technical issues. They're not responding to a virus, for instance. They're a political issue responding to a political problem. And a lot of this is bound up in looking tough, particularly right-wing governments who will want to look tough on security, will want to look tough on terrorism. And I think this is part of this in terms of looking like they're demonstrating a robust response.
Just to pick up off on Richard's point, which I thought he absolutely nailed it in his final point, that counter-terrorism is a political response to a political problem, and I completely agree with this. And we can see in this particular raising of the threat level that there seems to be that kind of desire to dissuade a potential terror suspect from engaging in any form of violent behavior. And I think this kind of ties into the broader approach that the British government and the security state in the UK, and indeed across the European continent and America, have been essentially using, and that is to try and dissuade individuals, either through coercion or persuasion or a combination of both things, to not engage in violent behavior. And I think that the raising of the threat level absolutely has something to do with trying to inform the public that the British security services, police service, and government are indeed control of everything. And
can I just ask you this, and then of course carry on? Are you saying that it's not that they are pretending there is a threat? It is that the authorities are aware that there is a threat, numerous threats perhaps, and they are saying, look, we are watching you, and we will make sure that you don't carry out what it is you plan to do. So it's basically threatening the terrorists with exposure. Is that right?
Yeah, there is a mechanism of deterrence, a desire to essentially inform potential suspects that the state has triggered particular motions and that they are more likely to intercept any attackers. But I think there's a more general there's kind of multi strands here. So one is to deter potential attackers. The other one is to inform the public that the British government and the security services have everything under check and balance and control. And I think
so let me throw
that
this one
ties
out
into
there.
the broader kind of framework that's being used to prevent attacks from happening by using a combination of tools, including arrest, detention, countering violent extremism, and communication.
So is this the best way of preventing attacks?
Well, no. These are tactical, short-term processes and actions that are triggered based generally on intelligence that's being received by the security and intelligence services. But the best way to respond to terrorism is not to get caught up in technicalities on how best to fight terrorists or armed struggle, but rather to address the socioeconomic and structural factors that drive individuals and groups to commit armed activity and violent behavior.
However, if, as Lewis says, these are deranged individuals, and we'll come to you, Lewis, on this one. These are deranged individuals with no necessary
I don't like the word
firm foundations in ideology. I mean, then they're always going to be there, aren't they?
This idea of them being deranged, only 30% actually had some kind of serious mental illness. Okay, so we look at mental health along a spectrum from there's personality disorders, there's neurosis, and then you got all the way up to psychosis. Only 30% were deranged. So this idea of this deranged, it's not necessarily the case. A very small percentage. In terms of
mentally unbalanced, whether it be through substance abuse or whatever, how do you go about stopping them? This is the point of this program, is to find out whether raising threat levels is the right way.
Yeah. You cannot stop. You cannot know who's going to wake up tomorrow morning, take a kitchen knife, and go on a rampage. You cannot know that 100%. It doesn't matter whether you raise the threat level or not. You cannot deter these individuals. They're not acting in response to foreign policy. They're not acting for religious reasons. They are looking out at the landscape and saying, oh, he's done it. I think I'm going to go follow him now. Or they've reached a point themselves where they've decided, I don't want to go back to the life I was living before. This is a rational choice for me.
Okay, so let's move this on. Let's move this on and bring Richard back into the program. You've heard what Lewis is saying, that basically there is no way that you can either predict or prevent individual acts of violence like these.
Yeah, I mean, Lewis's points are really interesting. His work is super interesting, but the issues or some of the problems raised by focusing on these factors of looking at guilt and shame from a policy perspective is very difficult, because you can't use that as the basis of a policy response or as a practical response to violent extremism or acts of terrorist style violence, because you can't find out all men, young men who are suffering with guilt and shame, and try and find out if they're going to commit an attack or prevent them from going about their lives in case they do. You have to think about the wider structural factors. We know that there are 1,000 different pathways in towards an individual deciding that the best course of action is to conduct random acts of violence. We know there are various different factors. There's a huge amount of research at the moment going into looking at the impact of societal polarization, going into discussion on these factors of polarization, these socioeconomic factors, these different kind of cultural and political factors.
All of which is, forgive me, all of which is a long-term strategy, when in fact,
yes,
for obvious reasons, people want to stop the attack that might be happening tomorrow, and they want to try and do so today. So when Luigi
exactly
Di Maio, one sec, Luigi Di Maio, I'm asking you this, Richard, because you were in Florence. He's the Italian foreign minister. He says we need better laws across Europe, a Europe-wide policy where we can tap phones, we can collect data, we have stiffer sentences, etc. That's the today solution, isn't it?
There's also an awful lot of work going on from the European Commission, from the EU point of view, to look at long-term solutions. I don't think a harder security response is the best response. I think we need to look at long-term structural and societal factors that lead people towards violence. We talk about individuals who just decide to do something, but there's a whole process behind that, including access to certain networks or violent networks, including a media which helps to propagate some of these acts of violence and push them into the headlight in problematic ways. So we need to be looking at that, and there is an awful lot of policy research that's currently going into that. But I think we need to avoid some of the very hard factors that characterize early responses and that really ultimately problematize minority communities, ultimately can lead to a backlash, can lead to processes of polarization, which have been shown to create the conditions for further violent extremism.
Okay, sorry, one of you, I couldn't work out whether it was you, Riz, or whether it was you, Lewis, wanted to say something. I stopped you. Who was it?
I said there is a very simple, immediate solution, right? That is a no shoot to kill policy. The desire to die is a big part of this. Why are people wearing fake suicide vests? Because they want to get shot in the head. A very clear message from EU policymakers: we will not shoot to kill. It will act as an initial deterrent, because if I think there's a chance I might survive this act, when I'm factoring it as an irrational thing, 30, 40 years in prison does not factor into my rational decision making.
I think they call it, some people call it suicide by cop. Whereas I don't think that's likely to happen, because you could say the public's still in danger unless you bring somebody down. But what do you make about what you're hearing?
Well, I mean, Lewis's research is interesting, but I find that there's too much of an emphasis here on the use of or the engagement in substance abuse, and that somehow contributing to a higher potential for violence. Now, I have no doubt that his results indicate this, but I think that the focus here is too much on the individual as opposed to the broader framework within which that individual exists and operates. And I think until there is a recognition of what those broader pictures are and how that broader picture can be addressed and how that individual can be placed within that broader picture, I think we're going to be hitting our head against a brick wall and not being able to find the kinds of solutions that we need realistically to address this problem.
But there are solutions for the long term in which you address societal ills and say, if we stop doing that, or if we encourage people to do this, then you stop people wanting to put themselves in that kind of position. And then there is so 1 second. Then there is the tomorrow solution. How do you prevent the attack that's going to happen tomorrow? And your answer is what, I wonder?
Well, you have intelligence and you have police work, and that requires resources, and we already have those resources in place. But the trouble is those resources are spread very thinly in the UK, because the threat perception and the suspects and individuals who are considered to be subjects of interest are too broad and too vast. So at the moment, the security and intelligence services have 23,000 individuals on their security radar. 3,000 of those are subjects of interest, which are considered to be people who are either involved in terrorism or are likely to relapse and go back into committing terrorism. Salman
So you do
Abedi,
what
the
Luigi
Manchester
Di
bomber,
Maio
is one of
suggests, and
those
you
people.
have much stronger laws, bring in something like the Americans did with the Patriot Act
David,
after
we've already
9/11.
got very, very strong laws. We've already got 14-day pre-charge detention period. We've already got the Countering Violent Extremism Strategy Prevent in the UK, the founder of that policy along with the Netherlands. And we've also got longer prison sentences and control orders and so on and so forth. And probably one of the most vast surveillance networks that Europe has when it comes down to dealing with suspects of terrorism. So when we're talking about solutions, we already have short-term tactical tools at our disposal that we can use. But what we don't have is we don't have an ability to have a grown-up strategic conversation around how to minimize and mitigate the risk of these individuals going on to become involved in political violence, because ultimately political violence is in response to a political problem, and political problems are not willing to be addressed by governments and international institutions in the manner that they should be.
Richard?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is very interesting that's coming out of this conversation is that there needs to be that reflection within governments, within European governments, within the UK. It's not just that the best response is not just to constantly produce emergency legislation in response to instances of attacks or concern. The response should be to critically reflect on the laws that we currently have. As has been pointed out, we have an awful lot of laws already in place, an awful lot of counterterrorism structure, and a lot of that is very problematic. A lot of that doesn't seem to be working effectively, or seems to be creating a cure that is exacerbating the problems in some ways. We can look at the fact that lots of European countries have not done critical analyses of their counterterrorism or counter-extremism approaches. They're simply not being done by governments. We can look at the attacks in London in 2019. We can look at the attack in Vienna, and we can see that these individuals have gone through de-radicalization programs. Now, whether or not they've been declared de-radicalized or whatever is beside the point, but the fact is, these programs don't always seem to be working.
They don't work in every instance.
Yeah. But there's clearly problems in some of the processes of de-radicalization and the terminology of de-radicalization.
I just want to go back to something
it's not effective,
which was some countries haven't studied these things carefully enough. In other words, they perhaps have got it wrong. The counterbalance of that is there may well be some countries that have a better approach to handling this and dealing with it and understanding it. And I'd like to get your idea of what those countries might be.
I mean, I think there is some effective work that's being done, which helps to bring together a lot of different social structures in offering support. We can see some of the models that have been introduced in Denmark with the SSP, which brings together schools and social services in order to offer support to individuals who look like they're engaging in violence. We can see it in some of the work that's being done in other Nordic countries, some of the work that's being done in Germany in response to looking at group-focused enmity. So how do we look at the way in which communities interact and look at some of the problems in terms of animosity towards certain communities and minority communities. I think that's all incredibly important, where we bring together that community angle and the national angle, and we focus away from the individual.
All right, quick one for Lewis as we come to the end of this program. Is it your belief that there's very little that can be done in the short term, that we're going to wake up tomorrow and read in the newspaper about something terrible that's happened overnight, and it is inevitable?
Yes, 100%. There'll be over the next few months, there'll be a flurry of more attacks because people are not acting for the reasons you think they're not acting for. There's this conflation, this belief that being an extremist makes you a terrorist. All of this counter-radicalization stuff, it's fatally flawed because it assumes that just because you're an extremist, you'll carry out terrorists. There are hundreds of thousands of extremists. In 20 years, how many men have actually pressed the button? 80, right? And all of this distraction, looking at theology, looking at this, it's completely misguided. complete waste of time. The focus has not been on the people that it should have been on. The studies have not been on the people who it should have been on.
Quick final word then from Riz, if I may. If we can't do much about it, then we have to live with the system we have. It's the best in a bad world.
No, we don't accept things at face value. We struggle to make them better, and I think this show is a part and parcel of that struggle to contest some of these commonly accepted ideas around terrorism and political violence, and to demand changes in policy and practice so we can mitigate and minimize the threat of armed violence so people can live their lives in peace and security.
If only, if only. Listen, thank you so much. Great to have all three of you back on the program. Good to see you. Stay safe. And wherever you happen to be watching this, we thank you for your time. Roundtable's available on YouTube. Just try and find TRT World YouTube Roundtable. You can see a collection of programs there. We hope you're back for the next one. From me, David Foster, and the team, though. Bye-bye for now.